started. It's now my pleasure to welcome to the stage Senior Regional Economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Dawson Ullrich.
Thanks, Sarah. Really happy to be here this morning. It was good to see some familiar faces out in the audience and hope to meet more folks today from all across North Carolina, as we can see. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I've only got about 20 minutes to get through a lot of important data and want to make sure we get to cover as much as possible. So since I work for the Federal Reserve, I get to remind you that the views that I'm going to express are mine alone and don't represent an official position of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to try to set the stage for a lot of the conversations that we're going to have today using data. And a lot of this data is very interesting right now. This is really an unprecedented time in many ways in the economy, and employment is certainly no exception. So this graph shows overall employment in the United States. This is how many jobs exist in the United States. And what I want you to notice here is two things. Number one, we have recovered to pre-COVID employment. However, if you look at that dotted blue line at the top, that's where we would have predicted employment would have been if we had stayed on the same trajectory, right, as we were pre-COVID. So as a nation, we have not recovered to that point yet. If you look at that monthly change in job numbers in thousands, the January report that came out 2 Fridays ago was really staggering. We were expecting around 100, and when I say we, I mean economists, we're expecting about 185,000 new jobs to be added that month, and it was 517,000 jobs instead. So we've had really incredible job growth just month over month over month at the national level. In North Carolina, it's been even stronger. So this is North Carolina employment. We don't have the January figures yet because those lag a bit for the state numbers. But even as of December, we had well more than recovered to where we thought we would be before COVID. So what is this about? This is mostly an in-migration story. So in 2022, around 150,000 people moved to North Carolina. We all know this, right? We see folks moving in. We hear, I'll have neighbors now that have come from out of state. And so because North Carolina has had a lot of in-migration, we've also seen very strong job growth. Now, I always like to point out to people that this does not look the same everywhere. This shows the footprint of the 5th District, the Federal Reserve 5th District, Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, which is the Carolinas, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. I'm the economist for North and South Carolina, but I have colleagues that cover these other states. And as you might imagine, the story is very different depending on where you are. So what this graph does is it indexes employment to 100 as of February 2020, and then it looks at how many jobs were lost and then the recovery back since then. And it's important to just pause for a moment and think about the fact that in the 5th District and nationwide, we lost between about 12 and 15% of jobs, just almost overnight, right? I mean, just an unprecedented, wild thing to have happen in the economy. And the recovery back from that has looked different depending on where you are. In our district, Washington, D.C. lags significantly. Why? Because Washington, D.C. relies on a couple things that haven't yet recovered, namely international and educational-based tourism and people coming into the office, right? So there's a lot of people that that live in Northern Virginia or Maryland that commute into D.C., and many of those people are now working remotely or on a hybrid schedule. So think about the number of businesses in D.C. like dry cleaners, sundry shops, lunch places that have really struggled with that shift. In the Carolinas, we've seen strong job growth. In North Carolina, so that top line is North Carolina, second one is South Carolina. North and South Carolina have significantly outpaced the rest of our states in the district, and North Carolina has significantly outpaced South Carolina. So let me back up for a second and say, I'm telling an interesting story so far, right? So we're here to talk about labor shortages and what's going on in the market. And I'm telling you we've added back all these jobs. So how have we added back a lot of jobs? In North Carolina, we're well above 200,000 jobs above where we were before COVID. So how can that be true and my local Starbucks doesn't have the lobby open at 2 o'clock in the afternoon? Because of the labor shortage, how are these things both happening? And so what I want to talk about is some of the shifts we've had in employment. People have changed how and where they work and who they work for during this period of time. This shows the change by sector, by major sector in employment in the United States between February 2020 and January 2023. And not surprisingly, nationwide, we're still down in leisure and hospitality jobs, which was the sector that got hit the hardest in the beginning. But maybe surprisingly, we're down almost as many jobs in government sector. Those job losses are different. Those didn't happen in March and April 2020. Instead, these government sector job losses, which are in local and state government, so federal government employment has stayed relatively flat. So these job losses in local and state government have happened slowly over time since then. People have left jobs in state and local government to take jobs in other sectors. Why is this happening? Well, part of it is that we can see in the data that the public sector, the state and local government jobs have not kept up with wage increases like private sector has. But there's something else happening too. We have people moving out of jobs like being a K-12 teacher or a state social worker. And we have them moving into other sectors such as business and professional services and transportation and warehousing. We see the same thing in leisure and hospitality. The job losses we're seeing there and the shortages that exist in leisure and hospitality today tend to be frontline customer-facing people. You can see that we've had even more of an increase in transportation, warehousing, and business and professional services than we've had a loss in those other two sectors I mentioned. So the same thing is true in North Carolina, except we've actually more than recovered leisure and hospitality. So government and natural resources and mining remain the only two sectors that are down, with government being the largest sector. But look at the strong increase we've had in business and professional services during that time. There are other things we can see by kind of digging into the subsector data. So for example, healthcare and social assistance looks really good here, but if you dig in deeper, you'll see some subsectors are actually really struggling. One of the ones that's struggling the most is nursing home employment. And if you dig down even further, you'll see it's the nursing staff, CNAs, that are really in shortage in nursing homes. If you dig into the education services sector, daycare workers are a real shortage. I know that's going to be part of the conversation today. So in my opinion, we're facing this reality where people have left very difficult, stressful jobs that traditionally did not pay very well into jobs in sectors like business and professional services and transportation and warehousing, which may pay the same, might even pay more, but are much less stressful. Now, this is reality. This is why it is difficult right now to fill jobs in certain sectors. But the issue remains that we still need to fill those jobs, right? We need CNAs to work in nursing homes. We need fast food workers. We need people to fill these roles. So I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves as people in business communities, as people in education, just as curious citizens, is how do we make these jobs more attractive in some way? Maybe part of it is wages, but that's not going to be the whole story, in my opinion. But how do we make these jobs attractive to where new people want to enter the market? And how do we involve people who have not been in the labor market previously to maybe come and take some of these jobs? As Sarah mentioned in her intro, labor force participation rates have not recovered. As a matter of fact, they're pretty far from having recovered. And I take this graph, I like to go all the way back to 1948. And I do that for an important reason, which is I actually personally feel like the labor market we're in is very similar to a post-World War II labor market, when demand was really high and we had a relatively limited supply of workers. But if you look at this graph, you'll see there was an amazing increase in labor force participation rates. And let me pause and remind you that labor force participation rates are the percentage of adults, non-institutionalized adults, that are either working or looking for work, okay? So that rate jumped tremendously between the mid-1960s and around 2000. So if you look at what happened during that period of time, there were two things that were driving that. Number one was women entering the labor force. So women entered the labor force in huge numbers. Overall labor force participation rate went up by 7 percentage points. Female labor force participation rates went up by 17 percentage points. The other thing that happened was that a big generation of baby boomers went from being children to workers. But what most people don't realize is that this rate has been falling since 2000. And if you look after the Great Recession, the slope had become even more severe. Now, right before COVID, we did see an uptick. That was primarily driven by people working longer and by some increases in minority labor force participation rates, but we haven't seen a recovery here. One of the things I do want to point out, if I had more time to talk today, I would show you this slide as well. But over the last 3 months, for the first time in modern U.S. history, Black labor force participation rates in the United States have now eclipsed white labor force participation rates. Now, this is partly positive, partly negative. The positive side is that the income gaps that exist between Black Americans and white Americans, we've estimated that around 30% of that income gap is driven by lagging male labor force participation rates amongst Black Americans. So that labor force participation rate coming up is a very good thing. That's great. But that's not what's driving the primary driver of the closing of that gap. The primary driver is the decline in white labor force participation rates. And I would argue that we're not going to see this recover in the short run. And there's 3 primary reasons: baby boomer retirements, changes in norms and attitudes around work, and the 50-year baby bust. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this. There are some other issues as well. The opioid epidemic plays a role, childcare, a number of people with criminal backgrounds, which we're going to cover a lot of these things today. But I really believe these top 3 are the 3 main drivers. The bad news is that this is a global issue. This is happening everywhere. But the good news is that the Carolinas are going to fare much better than the rest of the United States with this. And in addition, I think there are a lot of things that can be done to improve outcomes, and I hope that today is much about those conversations on how we do that. So let's talk a little bit about baby boomer retirements. Baby boomers represent 76 million Americans born between 1946 and 1964. They now range from 59 to 77 years of age. It is not a shock to us that this group is retiring in large numbers. We can do this math, right? We've known that we were going to have a wave of baby boomer retirements at some point. But COVID accelerated these retirements. And the St. Louis Fed has estimated that an extra 2.5 million baby boomers retired in 2020 and 2021. An interesting factor that is highly indicative of whether, how quickly these baby boomers are retiring is the wealth that they have. Baby boomers are the wealthiest generation we've had by far. And part of that is because they're the first generation that commonly had 2 working adults in a household. And so they have on average $1.2 million at the time of retirement. This wealth is allowing them to retire. It's also impacting their children's work ethic and availability, okay? And I believe that this is an important thing that factors into attitudes and norms around work. So the millennial generation tends to be the children of baby boomers. They are now between 26 and 41 years old. I point this out because people still think, people will call my children millennials. No, millennials are adults at this point. The younger ones are Gen Z. And there's probably even a generation beyond them that we just haven't named yet. If you look at the prime age male labor force participation rate, so prime age is 25 to 54 years old. So this is, in theory when you're done with school, but before you're old enough to retire. In 1980, 94% of prime age, this was the baby boom generation, prime age males were working or were either working or looking for work. In 2019, before COVID, that had fallen to 89%. And it's fallen even further at this point. That represents 3 million missing workers in the economy. So why are they working less? The data on this topic, and this is something I've studied a lot, partially because I have 3 teenage boys, and so I'm very interested in male labor force outcomes because I need them all to have jobs and one day move out of my house. I love them dearly, but at some point they gotta go. The research on this is rather depressing, especially amongst young white males. They are working fewer hours. More of them are not working. And the reason what they're doing in place of work is not very productive. So some recent work, really good paper by Aguiar et al., shows that between 2000 and 2015, work hours for men aged 21 to 30 declined by 12%. And they also found that 15% of men in the age group did not work a single week. They then go in and look at time use data to see how they're spending time. Because if the story is that younger men are more likely now to be stay-at-home parents or taking care of elderly or something like that, then it's a different conversation. but they estimate that 75% of that increased time and leisure was spent playing video games or computer leisure. And I read that, and every time I say that out loud, I feel like that's impossible. And then I look around my own household, and they're either playing video games or watching videos of other people playing video games, which is completely lost on me. This is an issue that we have to address and really think of, because in the last labor report, in the last payroll labor report that came out when we got that great news about the 517,000 jobs, it also reported that there were 5.3 million adult Americans that want a job but are not looking for work. So they're not counted in that labor force participation rate, right? Because they're not looking. So when I ask people, why would people want a job but not look for work? The first answer I get back is they're lazy. There are lazy people that exist. But there are also a whole host of other people that aren't looking for work that would like to work because they have non-skill barriers. They know they can't afford childcare, so what's the point? Or they have a criminal background and they've gotten rejected so many times that they've just stopped applying. Or they have a disability that makes it difficult for them to do a traditional job, right? So thinking about how to engage people that have not been engaged previous in labor force is very important when we're facing these sorts of numbers. I pretty strongly believe that the choices of this generation are highly tied to baby boomer wealth. When I talk to people, and my job is to get out and talk to people, there are a lot of baby boomers that are paying for their children into adulthood, paying for their things into adulthood. I call this extended adolescence. There are some of you, I can't see, the lights are bright, so I can't see your faces, but some of you in the audience are paying cell phone bills for adult children. Some people are, right? Some people are paying for rent. Some people have adults living in their house. This has been a cultural shift. No judgment there. I'll probably be doing the same thing in 10 years. But it's a cultural shift. It's a cultural shift. So the idea of you're 18 or 22 years old, you have to be out on your own is kind of gone out the window. And we've seen data that supports this. So while 94% of baby boomers had a job before age 20, that dropped to 87% for millennials, 5 million worker shortage. In 2014, for the first time since 18 to 70, adults were more likely to be living at home than they were with a spouse, young adults. In 2022, 18.7% of men and 12.4% of women aged 25 to 34 lived at home full-time with their parents. And a census study showed that 25% of these adults did not work a single hour in a week or go to school. So how do we engage these people? These are people that could be working, right? This could help us with the shortage. And so we really want to think about engagement as we go through today, I think. I'm going to skip this slide. Hopefully you'll have the slides after, but this shows some of the declining labor force participation. But I want to talk about the baby bust quickly before I have to move on to questions. So the baby bust is catching up with us. We have been below what we call replacement rate, which is the number of babies we need to have to replace our population without immigration. That number is 2.1. The 2 is pretty obvious to replace yourself and your partner, but it's a little higher than 2 because unfortunately not all infants make it to adulthood. So we need 2.1 births per female to replace. We've been below that rate for 50 years at this point. But it's starting to catch up with us because fertility rates have continued to fall. And I like to do this little exercise I'll do really quickly because this shows it really well. So I want you to raise your hand if one of your grandparents was from a family with 4 or more siblings. So one of your grandparents had 4 or more siblings. Okay, family of 4 or more. Okay, now raise your hand if one of your parents was from a family of 4 or more kids. Okay, lots of hands still. Okay, now raise your hand if you grew up in a family with 4 or more kids. Okay, many fewer. Okay, now raise your hand if you yourself have 4 or more kids. Okay, so there's 8 of you that are really helping us with labor. So thanks to all of you. I did the best I could with my 3. That explains what's going on, right? Baby boomers were born into a household with an average of 4.8 children. Now women are having an average of 1.7 children. And you can see that here in this population pyramid looking at 1970 versus 2020. This is in North Carolina. And the median age has gone from 26.5 to 38.9. This will continue to be a problem. And so we have to think about, once again, how to engage people in the labor force. We have to think about things like automation. which is, 3 years ago, if I talked about automation, people got nervous about that, like automation was going to take away all the jobs. And now people are like, we need automation to fill some jobs. The attitude has really changed there. So what do I think could help with this? The first thing is flexibility. According to LinkedIn, workers are much more likely to apply for jobs that are remote or at least hybrid. But it's not just about that, right? It's flexibility in location, hours worked, what I can do with my young children during the day, right? Flexibility in all ways. Another is immigration. I think that has to be a part of the conversation because based on just pure demographic numbers, if it's not, our population will start shrinking within the next 40 or so years. There also can be policy initiatives that can improve these outcomes. This could be anything from enhanced child tax credits to subsidized childcare to expansion of the Pell Grant. In Virginia during the pandemic, they got rid of their law that takes away people's driver's license if they owe money to the court system. That impacted thousands and tens of thousands of people in Virginia got their driver's license back. There's no doubt that helped their labor outcomes, right? How many of you could get to work every day without a car? There also need to be changes in recruiting philosophies. Could you hire a couple of retired workers 10 hours a week to do part of the work? Could you have a program that intentionally targets neurodiverse students? Maybe you could set up a program for those who've been justice involved. Not just opening the doors and saying, hey, everybody come in, but actually setting up programs to support these individuals who have faced non-skill barriers. Because in my opinion, just opening the gates doesn't fix the problem, right? People are still going to have the barriers. You have to have the support systems. And then the last is encouraging youth to develop in high-demand fields. The chancellor's discussion about computer science and math and engineering, it is difficult to recruit students into these fields. But we can improve that, right? We can start doing things differently at the youngest of ages to get students interested in that. And also, I believe that encouraging students to go into high-demand fields at community colleges is a huge part of this as well. There are training programs that students can do in 6 or 8 weeks that can completely change their economic situation. So I will stop there, and I'm happy. Hopefully somebody, Sarah, I think is going to come up here. Hopefully somebody submitted questions, and you're always welcome to connect with me via email.
Laura, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. We do have several questions. One I'll go ahead and answer, which is, yes, these slides will be available. If they're not already in your app, we'll be sharing them shortly. There are a couple. We have time for one, so I'll send these to you so you can respond on your own time. But is the cause for millennials living at home a cultural problem or an economic and access to affordable housing?
It's a great question. So I would say it's a both, but I think the cultural shift happened first. I started doing this research back in about 2012. I was a professor for 13 years before I was at the Fed, and I started noticing that I had fewer male students in my class and that their outcomes were lagging. And so I was able to get some federal government data that showed me where people lived at age 26. And it also gave me all their student loan debt, all their credit card debt, everything you could imagine about them, great data. And interestingly, the things that were most significant were not the student loan debt and the credit card debt. I thought that's what was going to stand out, but instead it wasn't. The three things that were the most significant, number one was if the person was male, they were more likely to be at home. The second was they were more likely to be at home if they didn't have a job at age 18. And they were more likely to be at home if they had lived at home their first semester of college. Didn't matter if they went back and forth, it was that first semester. So based on that research and other research I've done over time, I believe that much of this is about parental signaling. I joke that my teenage boys hate that I do this research because when they turn 15, I'm like, you got a job? Where are you going to go work? But I do believe that part of it now, affordable housing has become such an issue, but I also think it's a cultural thing. If you think back to when many of us were in school, when we graduated college, if somebody had said, oh, I'm going to go move home with my parents, there was a stigma attached to that. That stigma's gone. And so I do think part of it is cultural. And I mean, I'm a mom of 3, right? I've got one in college now. In a certain way, I'd love if he'd come home. But I do think much of it is about that parenting.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'll stay in touch because I have a 5-year-old, so I've got a while before I get there. But well, everyone, please help me thank Laura once again for being with us.
Thank you so much.